Hi. Okay, today I'm out for my walk and I want to talk about trauma. And the reason why I think trauma is so important to discuss and to really understand when you're dealing with chronic illness is because it is buried. A lot of trauma is buried. And a lot of trauma is scary, fearful to talk about, and it leaves us stripped of who we are. And it breaks us. It breaks a lot of times our hearts, our souls, and our identity with who we thought we were and who our place in the world. It breaks that. And it leaves us scared, shattered, alone, disconnected, disjointed, and feeling ashamed. And often very isolated and lonely. And okay, so for example, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some areas of my trauma and how they contributed to this chronic illness of years and years of being virtually unable to function and disabled. So, it all started for me, and those of you who've watched my story, it all started with me with just being a healthy, amazing, vibrant, happy individual with lots of dreams, lots of hopes, and felt a real sense of love and security in this world. When my mother died, I wouldn't call that trauma because although it was traumatic, I was still able to be me. I was still me. After my mom died, I still had those memories. I could still be the mother, the wife, the person that I was. My dreams didn't change, but it did leave a hole in my heart. It left an empty, big hole, and it did shake. It did shake my identity slightly in who am I without my mom? Who am I without that person who's always been my safety net, my best friend, my go-to for advice, my biggest cheerleader and champion and supporter, and the person who I could count on no matter what for unconditional love for my life. So when that is taken away from you, although it is traumatic, but it's not traumatic in the sense that something happened to you that destroyed your version of who you were. It shakes your core a little, and it leaves you feeling less solid of a footing on this earth than you once were. My best friend's gone. My biggest cheerleader, my unconditional love, the person I would look to for advice and to help me raise my children and to be there for me when things go wrong in my world. And who's going to do that for me now? And so our nervous system often goes on high alert at periods like that. It's overwhelmed with sadness, with grief, and then it starts to look around. Who's going to be that person now? Are you capable of being that person for yourself? Do you need to find someone to help you with that? Who's going to be your new best friend? Who's going to love you unconditionally now? Who's going to be there for you? Who's going to show you the way, teach you? And so you're already sort of on shaky ground, which is where I was when I started this journey. But I didn't realize that at the time. And so when my big traumatic event came, when I walked into the doctor's office for what I thought was a symptom that was annoying and a little bit scary, but that would obviously resolve. I never envisioned my life taking this turn, I trusted somebody. I didn't have my mom to ask for advice for. And the people who, I ignored my own inner voice. My husband, my father gave me advice, other friends gave me advice, and I listened, when I didn't listen to myself. And when my whole trauma came, and everything and all the symptoms that followed and the breaking down of my whole central nervous system and the whole trauma, literal trauma that happened to me, I don't know where I'm going with this. Hang on, I need to think, because this is important. It's important. So what I want to say is, as traumatic as the actual events of taking the medication and going through the withdrawal, going through everything, as traumatic as that was, and losing trust in all members of authority, doctors, the people that were left around me, my husband, my father, friends, just realizing oh my God, you're on your own and you can't trust anybody, and just having all of that fall away, and aside from all the physical symptoms that brought with it, the emotional symptoms, the just sheer terror, basically, of and my trauma and the whole thing, and I'm not going to get into that right here, but what happened years later was maybe more traumatic. The after effects of the initial trauma, when you're still suffering, when you're still got the illness, and when you're still in chronic pain, and you need to stuff things down. That's where the trauma really begins. It's when you're expressing in the moment, you're still talking, you're still trusting, you're still hopeful that someone's going to come and help you and save you, or whatever it is. But when you realize later on, much later, that you're alone, that you are on your own, and not only that you're on your own, but that you can't trust. You can't. I think the hardest part of the trauma for me, and excuse me if I'm just kind of all over the place here because it's a big subject, was having to stuff it down for everybody and the fear around that. So I knew I had to hide it from my children, because I knew I couldn't explain, they were too young, what was happening, what happened to a child, an adult situation. So I knew that my best source of not having this affect or burden them or ruin their lives was to hide it from them. And because I didn't know how long it was going to go, right? So I naively thought this was going to be months, and I could do it. So every time, the months would pass and it'd still be there, I'd just keep hiding it, because I thought eventually, how could this, had I known at the beginning that it would have lasted as long as it did, I probably would have taken a different route. But because I stuffed it down initially in front of them, because it was so horrifying that I couldn't let them witness or be a burden to it in any way, that I had to hold that in. And that's one big thing. As I'm going through something, I have to hold in my emotions, my feelings, my thoughts. I can't let them see. So it's a way of first hiding yourself. Then, doctors, right? I knew I couldn't, at some point, I had lost all hope with doctors. I had lost all faith in them. Not only had I lost complete faith in their ability to help me, and they had completely, written me off and said, there's nothing we can basically do for you at this point. Not only was that relationship completely severed, but the fear that if I did go back to them, telling them everything that was going on, all the symptoms that I had, that they could commit me to a mental institution. They could force me to take more of the medicine that hurt me, just because they didn't know what else to do with me. And it was over their head. Like, doctors, I was afraid, based on what happened to me, that they could force me away from my children, away from my family, away from my life, and lock me up and basically feed me medication that was going to kill me. So that fear was so traumatic. So not only could I not count on them for help, but I also had to hide things from them. I couldn't tell them the truth, because if I did, it was going to mean, you know, something bad. And that fear was, it was so traumatic. It was so traumatic to not be able to have anybody. And then your family at some point doesn't want to hear it anymore and wants you to be well and doesn't want to listen to your symptoms, and life goes on. And when you're around them, you feel a need to put on a show, put on an act, and pretend everything's fine, to stuff again your feelings down, your traumas down, your emotions down, your symptoms down, and pretend, and always feeling isolated and alone and cut off, and like nobody is there for you, nobody could understand, and nobody can help you, and nobody loves you enough to try, because it's too much, it's too overwhelming, and there's nothing that they could do anyway. So that's when the whole thing with my mom became a thing. Like, you know, then that grief of missing her piles on top of the trauma, because hey, she is the one person that would listen, that would be there, that would totally trust, believe me, and help me, and make others see, and get the doctors to listen, and get, you know, just, I would feel like I had a champion. And so it was very hard for me to champion my own recovery, because for the longest time I felt trapped. And I had stuffed everything down in order to survive. This was in order to survive the symptoms, the day-to-day in my life, hiding it from my kids, and just being able to stay alive and carry on. I had to literally stuff all that down. And that creates more trauma. It creates piles of emotions, loneliness, isolation, shame, guilt, destruction, like just such intense emotions that pile up in your body, and the pain rips through your body. The symptoms pretty much tear you apart from limb to limb. And I was left like a Buddhist monk who would have to sit meditating, acting serene while the symptoms were destroying me, in order to protect others, the people I loved, and also to keep myself, the rest of the little bit of me that was still intact, safe. Because if I had one more rejection, if I had one more thing go wrong, if I had one more, you know, person abandon me, or trauma happened to me, or, you know, anything. If anything else went wrong in that situation, I knew that I wouldn't make it and that I might die. So the stakes were very high. My body was in complete fight or flight response. And this is all happening at a subconscious level. Only years later am I able to look back and understand the role that trauma, because I thought, yeah, of course I was traumatized. You know, I went through an event, but really the role of trauma and grief and feeling alone and separation and not feeling like I had a place in the world, you know, a person, a champion. I wasn't unconditionally loved anymore, and just feeling so desperate, alone, and unheard, totally unheard, right? Who could I express all this to? Unheard. And by the way of unheard, probably at some level unloved. You know, even though I knew I was loved, misunderstood, and very sad. You know, there's a lot of grief underneath the fear and the actual trauma and the actual symptoms. There's a lot of emotions buried underneath them that come with them, but that we stuff down and we focus on the symptoms because we have to. Because if we don't, we may not survive. So our body chooses to go into fight or flight mode and to focus on the symptoms and to do whatever we can in the moment to survive them, because that's its best option. But what ends up happening is that the trauma builds, the isolation builds, the disjointedness from society and feeling alone, the shame builds, the sadness builds, the grief builds, and the emotions build without us really realizing it, and they keep the symptoms going without our knowledge. They're keeping the symptoms coming, gripping on, and staying and being as intense as they are, and we don't realize that literally the feelings and the emotions around the trauma of feeling unsure about who we are in this world anymore, and whether we're loved, and whether we're safe, and whether we're going to be okay and taken care of, are the exact feelings that keeps the illness holding on, and we don't know it. It's all subconscious, and we don't have the luxury or the time or even the mental or physical capacity to turn and look at them, because we're too busy trying to stay alive in the moment and survive the symptoms. And I understand when the symptoms are so high that that's literally all you can do, but the unraveling of the illness and the healing comes from actually, when you do the emotional work, to look inside, to unravel the feelings, to feel them, to feel that loneliness, the abandonment, the isolation, to see it, to see how you have actually self-protected and encased yourself. And I really love this quote from Steve Ozanich, and I might get it wrong, but he said, the healing comes from unmelting the frozen self. From unmelting the frozen self. And that is so true. And frozen not as in fear frozen, but like you've frozen your emotions, yourself, your identity. You have wrapped yourself up in pain and in symptoms as a blanket to protect you from the fact that you don't feel safe in this world because of what's happened to you, and you don't feel heard or understood or loved or like you even matter, and you don't believe you're going to be okay at a fundamental level, and that keeps us living in fear instead of living in health. And so this video is going too long, so I'm going to end it, but I just want to say, if you are struggling if you're in the throes of it, don't give up. You can do this, and you will do this. And you may have to focus on the physical symptoms, but there will come a point, even moments, when you can turn and start to look at yourself, to feel the feelings, to dig deeper, to unravel it from an emotional level. And as much of that as you can do at any point really helps. Let yourself cry, let yourself feel, and let yourself understand and see what is happening. It's very hard to rise up and see it from a distance, but once you do rise up and see it from a distance and get the clarity that you need, you can actually literally start to make steps forward to healing. And so I hope this helps. And if you do want to do a consult with me about clarity for healing, it could help, because having somebody with you to see all those pieces that are often go undiscovered is critical. And it doesn't have to take you as long as it took me to see that. So I hope this has been helpful.